Hi, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from wherever you are joining us today. We'll give it a couple of more minutes while our participants join us. Welcome to the fourth episode of the CGIAR Road from COP29 to COP30 Fireside Chat Series. In this series, which we started at the beginning of this year, we convened global experts to unpack the negotiation tracks that are shaping the climate agenda ahead of COP30. In our last session, we explored the global goal on adaptation. We reflected on the outcomes from COP29 and we looked at the work of the experts looking ahead to SB62 and looked at various ways in which adaptation efforts across agriculture, water, health, and ecosystems were shaping up. If you missed that, my colleagues will paste the link to it so you can watch it later. Today's session is about Just Transition Work Program, which is a critical and evolving track established at COP27 to ensure that climate action is fair, inclusive, and aligned with national development priorities. The Just Transition Work Program supports the implementation of Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement by fostering low-emission, climate-resilient development that leaves no one behind. Of particular interest to us as the CGIAR, as the world's largest publicly funded research and development organization working on agri-food system, is how just transition affects the agri-food sector. So while the just transition provides an important foundation, key questions remain. What does a just transition look like in different sectors and regions? Of our interest today is the agri-food sector, and how can it be operationalized at scale and with urgency? So some of the issues were raised in the submissions that we recently made to the third Just Transition Work Program dialogue. This was a joint submission by the CGIAR FAO and another joint submission led by the CGIAR with civil society colleagues from United Nations Foundation, AGNES, Mercy for Animals, and Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, as well as ILRI, the International Livestock Research Institute, where we highlighted how agri-food systems remain largely absent from the current just transition discussions, despite its importance for mitigation, adaptation, and livelihoods. So we urge the inclusion of language around low greenhouse gas emission development in a manner that does not threaten food production. So these were some of the submissions that we had made, and we were actually quite delighted to see that at the recently concluded third dialogue that took place in Panama, and many of us joined in person or
Hello.
online, that, hello, is that, um, um, yeah, okay, let me continue. I heard some noise. Sorry about that. So we were quite happy to see that agriculture featuring quite a lot in many of the submissions, apart from the submissions that I mentioned earlier. In some ways, Just Transition focuses on shifting to a low carbon economy in ways that supports affected workers, communities, and industries, and promoting social equity and environmental sustainability. I will not go too much into the details because we do have a very expert panel today to talk a bit more about what the just transition means for different sectors, for labor transition, but particularly for the agri-food sector. So as we said that at COP27, the world leaders agreed on the Just Work program on just transition. Then COP28 had emphasized gender through gender responsive just transition and climate action partnerships. Just transition is key for agriculture sector, as we have already kind of mentioned before. We at the CGIAR, we stress the importance of just transition for agriculture, recognizing that agri-food system is both vulnerable to climate change and is a significant emission source. So overall, we have been calling for capacity building and multi-stakeholder partnerships and targeted social support in support of just transition in this particular sector, and saying that just transition is more than energy systems, but it's also about agricultural systems. So, in the very recently held third dialogue during the Climate Week in Panama, part of the discussion focused on unpacking the full range of means of implementation. So, some of our speakers would talk about the means of implementation today. This includes finance, capacity building, and technology transfer. And then that dialogue also focused quite a lot around the enablers. So coming back to this with that brief introduction, and while we wait for more of our participants to join, let me introduce our speakers. If we can have the PowerPoint up. Yeah, okay, it's up there. So thank you so much for our speakers who are joining us today. This would be a more of a fireside chat, interactive chat, where we would be exploring how the Just Transition Work Program can better integrate agri-food systems, especially in low and middle income countries, and what is needed to scale up finance, capacity building, and technology transfer for a just and equitable transition. Our first speaker, our first panelist today is Dr. George Womukoya. He is the team leader of the African Group of Negotiators Expert Support, AGNES, and he will be discussing some of the outcomes of the Just Transition Work Program dialogue. And he would also shed light on what we can expect from the parties for SB62 and the broader agenda towards COP30. Welcome, George. Delighted to have you back. You have been a long-term friend of the CGIAR and the work that we do with the farmers in the Global South. Thank you for joining us today. Our
Thanks,
second
Aditi.
panel, yes, thank you. Our second speaker today is Dr. Inkar Kadir Zanova. Sorry, Inkar, I hope I got your name correct. She is the Senior Natural Resources Officer at the Food and Agricultural Office on Climate Change, Biodiversity and Environment. And today she will examine the gaps in implementation within this work program, particularly focusing on finance capacity building and also sharing some of the successful examples. Welcome, Inkar, and
thank you, Aditi, for the introduction and for the invitation.
Thank you, and lovely to have you here. Our third panelist today is Mustafa Kamal. He is the Director, Priority Action Programs, Transition Towards Environmentally Sustainable Economies and Societies at the International Labour Organization. Mustafa will speak on what a just transition means for agriculture in the low and middle income countries and how to build trust between communities and governments, and again share some of the best practices for ensuring reskilling and inclusion of the vulnerable workers who might who have to transition to low emission jobs, and for that they would need skilling. So Mustafa, ILO has been a very big proponent of just transition from a labor perspective. So we are delighted to have you here today and looking forward to your interventions. Welcome.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And then we would have our final panelist is Elodie Guon. She is the head of civil society engagement at the World Animal Protection, and she will speak on how scientific community can better support policymakers under the Just Transition Work Program. So with that, welcome to all of you. I can start with, I think we would have, are all of us spotlighted at this point, Vanessa? Yes, okay, wonderful. So thank you so much. I will start with George. George, you have been with the AGNES for a well, you are the AGNES, and you have been engaging in various negotiation tracks, taking an extremely active role in the COP discussions as well as in the SB. So from you, George, my question is, how do you see the Just Transition Work Program and its importance um, from an agriculture lens, from an Africa lens? And in that context, what did you think, what the outcomes of the dialogue that just recently happened a couple of weeks ago? So, and also what do you expect from the parties for SB62, specifically on this work program and from an agriculture and Africa point of view? Over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Aditi, and thanks, colleagues. Mustafa, great to see you, because Mustafa was one lone voice talking about just transition in many of our meetings. Secondly, I must confess and declare interest that I did facilitate the negotiations that resulted in the preamble ATCO 2 and ATCO 3. And so I'm very familiar with the provisions of ATCO 2, paragraph 1C, which is simply was making sure that the financial flows are consistent with the low emission and climate resilient development pathway. And there was a reason behind that. The reason was that if we wanted to get that transformation, then we must make sure that any resources being budgeted for or through the partnerships should align with that trajectory. And I think that's how now the question of if we were to transition from the business as usual to this low emission and climate resilient, are we all at the same level? And the answer is no. And even within the country, those changes can actually disrupt the already existing practices and particularly to the workers and the farmers. In this respect, therefore, from the agriculture and food security perspective, I know Aditi wants me to talk about agri-food systems, which, as you know, we have difficulties with it, given the structure of the UNFCCC, where we have silos in terms of how do you account emissions, and that's why we talk about agriculture separate from the transport part and the rest. From the Africa perspective, and that was one of the key issues that led to the difficulties in not having the text, is the whole question of how do we apply equity across the board in this, because the discussions around just transition seem to have moved faster towards energy and forgot that, in fact, there are other key sectors that may, in fact, require attention. And what I normally tell colleagues is that let's look at Africa. If you look at Africa and you look at the greenhouse gas inventory, you'll see that the main source of emissions are actually from the AFOLU sector. And therefore, when now we seem to be looking at energy, looking at then it means that Africa will not deliver on the Paris Agreement, because the sources of emissions will still be from the agriculture, forestry, and other land use. And therefore, we need to look at the whole system approach to ensure that, and the whole economy to ensure that all the sectors, and particularly those that are in a developing country, which is APOLU sector, are given the attention and support. And that's why we bring in the whole question of equity. And then, of course, the whole question of CBDR. Do we expect all countries to respond to in the same manner? The answer is no. And that's why if you look at Article 2, paragraph 2, it talks about those principles of equity, CBDR, and the rest. That's how they were brought in, to make sure that as we transition to the low emission and climate resilient, then we have to take that into account. But I always say that many of us don't seem to look at the provisions, particularly on 2.1b, because 2.1b, we try to find a balance between the adaptation and mitigation. And that's where the whole questions of core benefits comes in. And I've always, whenever I've had an occasion to discuss with the FAO and the CGIAR, I've always reminded them that your comparative advantage is trying to unpack what are those actions that, if implemented, will deliver both adaptation and mitigation, because then it will be accounted for under the NDC, because under the NDCs, core benefits arising from adaptation actions that are of mitigation nature will be accounted for in that respect. Now, what do I see as the way we're progressing? One is that we must accept that there's a dichotomy between developed countries and developing countries. And within developing countries, we also have the EOSIS, and because of their location and the rest, the experience, and they will experience the transition differently from the LMDCs, which are those that are either fossil fuel based and therefore heavy in emissions. And it's on that basis that you find that G77 sometimes we have difficulties in having a common position. As you know, I facilitate, I'm the lead coordinator for G77 on agriculture. And so I do understand the dynamics that happens within G77 before we reach such an. And whenever we don't have a common position as G77, then usually it becomes very difficult to reach an agreement. And so SP62 is going to be very difficult because one, we based on the dialogues we've had and the text that was there, and of course it will depend as to whether countries will want to use it or not, because that they'll have to raise it, and if it is, then the challenge you will have is that countries will still go back to their original positions, which then makes it very difficult to make progress. And in this respect, therefore, what I will always encourage is for those of you who are partners in this space, is to see how do we construct what we normally call bridging proposals that looks at the different formulations and trying to come up with a proposal that will speak to each other interest with a view of arriving at the conclusion. The other sticking point, which I think we must be alive to, is the global stocktake, because the way the global stocktake has been structured and also the way NDCs generally are, being that they depend on a domestic and international funding, then you tie it together with a just transition. Then how do you tie it in such a manner that it is reflective of the interests of both partners or the parties in that respect? And that's why you see difficulties in linking that just transition with the GST and the rest. And of course, the other one which normally comes out is the partnership, which is important. But the question that arises is that how do you make a decision within the UNFCCC process on an international body that is outside the UNFCCC? You have no control over it. For example, FAO has its own, instrument membership. ILO has its own instrument and membership. And can we direct ILO, FAO, World Bank, or whatever to do anything? And if so, how do we frame it? And I think that is the intention of making financial flows consistent with. Because if we are going to do that, then it means that we must find a mechanism where we are able to engage with all these instruments in that respect. So yes, it's going to be tough. But I think Brazil, the way I see it, Brazil will definitely aim to have a decision in that respect, because if we don't have that, then these low emission strategies that are being developed will mean nothing. And I think the aim is we need to concretize those aspects in that respect. And from the agri-food system, farmers, of course, and the whole question of retooling, reskilling becomes very, very important in that respect. So I'll stop there and happy to come back. Over to you, Aditi.
Yes, thank you, George. Those were very important points. So one of the things that I heard, and it's impossible to summarize your rich insights, is about we are not talking about just transitions enough in the context of agriculture. Though to my pleasant surprise, actually, we did a little bit of analysis of the 51 submissions that were made to the third dialogue. And we found that 38 of those 51 documents actually mention energy, and 26 of them mention agriculture, forestry, land use. So, and that's the largest after energy. Right. So, I mean, mention of just transition in the context of industry, manufacturing, or buildings were much relatively lesser. So, I think that as a result of the work for many of the constituencies, the importance of agriculture in the just transition is indeed increasing. And the other thing I noticed was a lot of focus around the means of implementation. I think that, like for any other negotiation track, means of implementation remains extremely important. Here, I would like to take a minute to say that apparently there is some technical glitches that is preventing some of our colleagues from actually joining this webinar. I mean, the webinar link is taking them to a registration page and then not. So hence we have a bit of a lower attendees, but my colleagues are at it and working on it. We have a new system. There is a glitch in that system. Okay, so Vanessa says this was solved now. So hopefully we will get a few more participants, because we usually get more. So just to, then I would now, and thank you, George. I'll come back to you with the second question in a little while. I now want to move to Inkar. And Inkar and her group and us, we have been doing a lot of brainstorming around how to make just transition in agriculture a topic that kind of takes off and builds a body of work around it. So we did some advocacy work around it together with FAO during the COP29 in Baku. And again, we have made 2 joint submissions last year as well as in this year. So to you, Inka, the question is really something that George touched upon. It's really the means of implementation, isn't it? It's the finance, it's the capacity building, it's the technology transfer that keeps repeatedly being emphasized. And these were largely absent from the draft text last year, and there was no conclusion as such. So what can we do as a part of our community? What can be done to elevate these priorities in the upcoming negotiations? How can we make just transition very, very focused on how to do it, not what it is, but how exactly to do it? So to you, Inkar, around maybe 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Aditi. Thank you for the question. And George, also thank you for sharing your insights. It's really interesting to hear from the first-hand person who really participated in the negotiations and led them. As you know, FAO is not a negotiating party, right? We are a so-called active observer. We're happy to contribute to this common understanding and try to move the dialogue a step further. And it was really very unfortunate that even though the COP29 was dubbed as the climate finance COP, the discussion on the means of implementation in the context of the Just Transition Work Program were not conclusive. And there were a few other stumbling blocks during the negotiations, and George has eloquently already pointed at those. So without really, knowing exactly how the SB 62 negotiations will unfold, I just want to share a few ideas what could be helpful in putting these negotiations a step forward. So one of the strategies could be to be very upfront and explicit and draw the direct link between the different negotiation tracks and link the discussions on the means of implementation with the just transition outcome. The means of implementation should be presented as an indispensable enabler of the just transition, as an absolutely integral element for just transition planning and implementation. I think since the moment when the UNFCCC began the negotiations on just transition back in 2010 until now, the conceptual framework has evolved, even though it continues evolving and it maybe encompasses new elements to it. But what has been lacking so far is also what George has earlier mentioned, the concrete solutions, how exactly the just transition could be implemented and facilitated in all the sectors. And I think it is high time to move the conversation away from the fossil fuel sectors and energy and focus on agriculture as well as the other vulnerable sectors. Agriculture is indeed indeed a significant contributor to the GHG emission total, but it is also very vulnerable sector, but it's as well the sector that provides the livelihood to so many. So in the negotiations, it could be helpful to consider the breadth of the impacts and the high number of vulnerable people, and to understand that this vulnerability profile and socioeconomic vulnerability profile in developing and developed countries is really very, very different, as well as the emission profile. And agriculture does play a significant role specifically for just transition in developing world. It's also important to recognize that those support mechanisms that are needed for the sector-specific transitions are very different. And the labor force in energy sector is highly different from labor force in agriculture. The smallholder farmers and the vulnerable communities need different type of support than the energy engineers or the energy users and energy producers. So I think it's important to specify the peculiarities and particularities of different economic sectors. It is also important to think about the justice and fairness priorities in the context of climate finance negotiations, and look at the climate finance and how the funding could be directed to just transition activities in different sectors, in particular in agriculture and fisheries, which are really very important for LDCs and seeds, and where those financial flows should be directed to, and which forms of sustainable livelihood are most relevant for developing countries, and how those sustainable livelihoods could be financed and supported, so that we generate the critical buy-in and also come up with the solutions that not only contribute to the climate-related goals, but also improve the socioeconomic situations on the ground in rural communities. I think beyond the consistency in negotiations across different negotiation tracks, we can also raise the issue of consistency in mandates of different UNFCCC bodies and the implementation mechanisms. And it will be good to have the conversation on how to streamline the support and avoid the duplication, but also highlight that support is needed for the domestic policies and to create the right enabling environment for the just transition policy and action. And then also the means of implementation consists of three distinct parts: the climate finance, technology, and capacity building. And I think if the conversation around the climate finance has been, very, very active during the recent COPs, we see that the importance of technology transfer and the importance of capacity building at all levels may not be, very high on the political agenda. So it is important to prioritize these conversations as well. And when it comes to the technology transfer and enabling developing countries to do this necessary technological leapfrogging, we also have to talk about different mechanisms such as the knowledge sharing, engagement of countries in the South-South modality, South-North modalities, so that we encourage the diffusion of the climate technology. Maybe in conclusion, I wanted to say that a lot of those topics or discussions, they have been covered years ago and under different negotiation streams. So it's important for the negotiating parties to maybe consolidate their positions as well prior to arriving to the SB and the COP later this year. And I think one of the common denominator could be the findings of the first stocktake, which clearly highlighted the importance of considering socioeconomic implications of climate action. We can't continue talking about pure mitigation action, not recognizing the ripple effects that go across the society, and in the same way also of any kind of climate action. So, but then I think as the agriculture community, we also have some responsibility, which is probably shared responsibility. I think we have to continue sharing our views, and it will be good to come up with the common understanding for agriculture or for the agri-food systems, if we think about the broader context. What is just transition, what it constitutes, and what are the means of just transition, and how we could turn them into practical solutions. And I think we have a lot of ingredients to answer this question, but maybe we're lacking a one framework that could be, shared among all and supported by all.
Thank you so much, Inkar, for that. And particularly, of course, finance is very much in focus, though the finance discussion has almost happened without a sectoral focus. So if we might need to actually bring the focus back to some of the more climate vulnerable sectors where just transition is needed, and agriculture is one of those. And I also liked your focus on the capacity sharing and the important role that science can play in that. So I'll come to Elodie in a minute around to talk about how science can be of service to these negotiation practices. I'll come back to Inkar in a while. But let me go to the third speaker, Mustafa Kamal. So, Mustafa, I want to bring the discussion again much more in focus into the agriculture in the low and middle income countries. So, what exactly would a just transition look like in practice in these countries? Who should be the key actors, and what kind of processes are needed to build co-ownership and trust? I think before this, George talked about the lack of trust. We talked about the very different positions when it comes to agriculture negotiations between the global north and global south, and similar issues are likely to surface if agriculture becomes a big part of the just transition pathway. So, with negotiations. So, can you tell us a bit of your reflections wearing your ILO hat and decades of experience working on this?
Thanks a lot, Aditi. It's a pleasure to connect with George, Francis, Carr, ILRI, and colleagues in this discussion. So, first of all, I think we all are paying attention to agriculture, not only from what George said in the beginning. In many parts of the world, it is actually the biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions, but also importantly, from the world of work perspective, because agriculture is a major source of employment. Today, we estimate that there are 1 billion people employed in agriculture, which is 28% of employed people in general. Now, obviously, it is not the same according to different world regions. Agriculture employment has declined in the industrialized countries, but in the low and middle income countries, it is still very, very significant. And I want to speak about just transition from this understanding that we know that climate change itself, and here I think, Aditi, from the IPCC perspective, we know that there are physical effects that climate change will have on agriculture in the sector. Now, we in the ILO have been looking at that not only from changes in rain patterns, the production side, but in terms of also occupational safety and health. And this is one of the sectors mostly exposed to the phenomenon of heat stress. The warming of temperatures, and at certain levels of heat, the just human body can no longer be productive. And so we've run in 2019 a global assessment of how heat stress impacts on labor productivity and occupational safety and health. What we find is that if current patterns of warming go, based on IPCC data, the world is going to lose, on average, more than 2% of working time. Now, this can be very abstract, but if you turn 2.2% of total working time into full employment equivalency, it comes to 80 million jobs. And the regions that would be mostly impacted would be Western Africa and Southeast Asia. So there, we speak respectively of, some 10 million jobs just in Western Africa, close to 10 million jobs. So that impact on health and productivity is really a major concern. Now, the second is the policies that countries will take to mitigate climate change and to some extent adaptation in agricultural sector may have unintended consequences that may be negative on farmers, on their income and jobs. So from that understanding, for us, just transition is how do we minimize the risks of economic and social disruption? And here it means, loss of income, loss of jobs for farmers, but also loss of business assets, for small holders, because farms are also small businesses in many cases. There's wage employment. I think close to half of these 1 billion people are in wage employment, but there are many, many self-employed women and men in agriculture. So how do you ensure that income support, job security, business asset support is one element? And from that angle, from a labor perspective, there is an important role that social security has to play. Social security is really what we all benefit from. When we are sick, can't work, we still have a source of income because we are covered. When we have an accident or anything happens to us, we are protected somehow and secure an income. So last year, for the first time, more than 50% of the world population got access to social security. But the sad story is that still, of the 20 countries most vulnerable to climate change, and we know these are in the low and middle income countries, less than 9% of the population has access to any social security, and many of them are in the informal agricultural sector. So how do we really expand social security? Is that element of minimizing the negative impacts. Now, obviously, the transition in agriculture, and as Inka was saying, it can be brought into food systems, can offer new opportunities for jobs and more and possibly better jobs in the agricultural sector. We have done 3 years back a regional study on just transition and economic transformations in Latin America and the Caribbean. It's a study we've done with the Inter-American Development Bank. In that part, we found a painful transition in the energy sector, but in terms of agriculture and food systems, we estimated a potential for 15 million jobs. And that comes from the use of plants as a basis for protein production. And we know that in the food systems, there is this gradual shift to move gradually away, at least in some parts and for some consumers, from meat-based protein consumption to plant-based protein production. So that offers that key opportunity of 15 million jobs. And as we speak, we have been discussing with Inger, colleagues in FAO, the World Bank, and others to carry a global assessment of how this job creation could come from that shift. So just to end, I think for us, the just transition is how do we minimize those negative impacts potentially on agriculture farmers and communities on the one hand, and the other, how do we open up new opportunities for transformation? Because, agriculture, whether you're in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, anywhere, is not static. And I want to come to this when we talk about skills, but there is really massive transformation, modernization, the use of information communication technology. And a last interesting part is that there is increasingly young people coming back to agriculture and doing it not in the old way as our grandfathers were doing it, but with innovation, using ICT to run irrigation farms. And this is really an opportunity in the discussions on just transition.
Right. Thank you, Mustafa, for also highlighting some of the new opportunities coming in terms of youth and focusing on the differences, the particular circumstances of the LMIC. So I would now go to and to carrying on some of your theme from industrial livestock agriculture to more other types of agriculture. And I know Elodie has a lot to say about that. So to you, Elodie, I have this question around also bringing the role of the scientist and the research. What are the risks of omission in this, and how can negotiators, scientists, and practitioners ensure food, agriculture, gender, youth are meaningfully reflected? Because we all know those are extremely important. Again, a quick analysis of the submission shows that the word woman, indigenous people, youth, all of them feature very prominently in each of the submissions. So over to you, Elodie.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to join this great panel and present the views of the civil society on just transition. This is really a critical issue for the climate justice movement and the food and agriculture groups of the Women and Gender Constituency, YUNGO and ENGO, the main climate justice and climate action network. I've recently addressed a cross-constituency letter to the COP30 presidency to ensure that the just transition package includes and facilitates a just transition in agriculture and food systems. So it's really positive to hear that a lot of submission as well push for that. And this is actually going along a global mobilization of the climate justice movement on just transition. The Just Transition Rising campaign was launched a couple of weeks ago, where we heard from frontline communities and groups affected by climate change. As was noted, agriculture is one of the most affected sector. And the mobilization will continue at the SB and escalate until COP30. So to go back to your question, I would like to really go back to the Just Transition Alliance definition of just transition and really highlight that just transition is a principle, a process, and a practice. The principle of just transition is that a healthy economy and clean environment can and should coexist. And the process of just transition should be a fair one that should not cost workers or community their health, environment, jobs, or assets. Or if it does, it should be fairly compensated. And in practice, and that's the most critical, is that for a transition to be just, the most impacted communities and workers affected by the pollution and the transition should be in a position of leadership to craft a policy solution. So we've heard from Inkar Mustafa that a billion of people rely on agriculture for income and sustenance. But out of those 4 million, close to 40% of the agriculture workforce are actually women. Mustafa touched on that. Like youth employment used to be significant in the agricultural sector, especially in global South country. But we are seeing actually youth living there. So it's critical to get them involved in order to shape in the discussion and shaping policy. To shape a sector that also work for them, and also new job, like there is job opportunity there if it's done right with youth involvement. But what I'd like to highlight as well is that beyond women and youth, indigenous peoples are another critical group that can offer adapted solution pathways for just transition. So we know that they steward 80% of global diversity, while at the same time facing the climate impacts. But the indigenous people food system as traditional food system have sustained their communities for generation while maintaining biodiversity and ensuring food security. We also know that that sad fact that suicide amongst farmers has become a universal phenomenon. The agriculture sector at the highest rate of suicide globally than any other sectors. So the current system is clearly not working for them either. So again, farmers are under extreme pressure. They operate on very thin margins, facing high input costs and already facing the effect of climate change. So if we do not include agriculture and give priority, a seat at the table to all this impacted group in the Just Transition Work Program, we risk leaving them all behind. And we know all these groups depend on this sector for their livelihood, and they are also amongst the most vulnerable to climate impact. But for this to be possible, it's what's critical and what we advocate for is really the establishment of a strong framework for transparency and accountability to ensure equal representation and participation of these groups, but also small and medium enterprises, cooperative and independent producer in the decision-making process. So the transition we're looking for do not reproduce existing inequalities. And on the environmental side, previous panelists have already highlighted how the agriculture food system accounts as the second largest contributor to global green gas emission, with industrial agriculture being a major driver of deforestation, land degradation, and biodiversity loss. Also, agriculture and food also account for at least 15% of fossil fuel used annually. So without transforming the food and agriculture sector, food-related emission alone could exceed the 1.5 carbon budget. This really shows how one transformation cannot be tackled without the other. So even though, as George mentioned, so far the Just Transition Work Program has been really focused on energy. If we want to transition out of fossil fuel in the energy sector, we will have to talk about transforming the agriculture sector, and particularly the industrial agriculture model that is reliant on fossil fuel for the production of fertilizer and pesticide. And also, the Just Transition Work Program has been mitigation centric, but the focus, broadening the scope to food system transformation and agriculture, will have mitigation and adaptation benefits, especially in transition towards equitable, climate resilient, human and agroecological food system that nourish people, but also protect the planet and the animals. So really to conclude, discussion must now move beyond increasing yields and really reducing emission intensity to tackling systemic issues confronting the entire agriculture and food system that block the transformation we want to see.
Yeah, thank you, Elodie. I thought that your focus on that just transition is both a concept as well as a process is very well taken. Also, the different transition pathways that industrial agriculture versus smallholder agriculture needs to take was also, I think, a very important point. While for the audience there, I understand this is a webinar, so it's not easy for you to raise your hand or ask questions. But please, if you have questions or anything you would want to ask the panelists, please put it in the chat or in the Q&A, and the panelists will take note. So we only have 10 more minutes. And I think our panelists have done a tremendous job in kind of walking us through the various complexities of what just transition means. But at the heart of all of it is protecting the most vulnerable, enabling the transition to a low emission food systems, but it's not only about low emissions, but it's also about not only mitigation, but it's also mitigation versus adaptation. So with the remaining 10 minutes left, I will again come perhaps in the same order and very briefly ask each one of you to limit your answer to just 2 minutes at the most, is around some of the practical steps that we can do from now. And we, as in all of us, researchers, research organizations, FAO, all the civil society, all the UN bodies together. So, for you, George, my question is very, very quickly, what are the key political entry points between now and COP30? You did mention the other tracks, such as the finance track as well as the GST. But are there any other political entry points between now and COP30 that would help us shape a more inclusive just transition work program?
Yeah, thanks. Quickly. What I would propose is that under the Sharm el-Sheikh joint work on implementation of climate action and agriculture and food security, we're going to have a workshop which is dealing with the holistic and systemic approaches, which I think is very, very important. The question will be, what are those transformative actions that would lead to, and then consideration of the just transition will be important. And so we do have an opportunity at SB62 to inform the GST, the just transition work program. Number two is that there is a report, a synthesis report that has been released by the Secretariat under the Sharm el-Sheikh Agriculture Program, and it is dealing with how the constituent bodies are dealing or addressing agriculture. And I think this is what Inca was raising. Is there coherence? One of the things that we'll be discussing is coherence. And unfortunately, and this is the challenge I want to throw to all of us, is that, and thanks to Aditi and your team and FAO, that you're getting agriculture people from just concentrating on Sharm el-Sheikh to talk about the other work streams. And I think one of the things we should be aiming in Bonn is to get people, agriculture negotiators, not only to concentrate on the Sharm el-Sheikh, but also to engage in the other work streams, particularly the just transition, because then from there we'll be able to put the holistic view, given that there's no appetite within the UNSCC to focus on sectors. And therefore, the just transition provides us with an opportunity to have a holistic view of approach. Thank you.
Thank you. So the takeaway is that try and make agriculture a part of other streams, and just transition is one of those. In the GGA also, we have a whole sectoral kind of theme on agriculture. So that is a good insight. I think we have also realized that through our work with the SSJWA, that alone is not enough, because agriculture should feature in other places too. So Inkar, again, very quickly, and I apologize for the time constraint, but do you have any example from the work that the FAO has been doing, examples of a successful enabling mechanism that has worked or can be scaled to support just transition?
Yeah, actually, there are many examples, but maybe they are at the moment still in the pilot phase or in the testing phase, and it's important to scale them up. But just to maybe give a few ideas of what those mechanisms could be. It's the work around the social dialogue and participation. In order to give the legitimacy to the just transition plans, they have to be owned by those who are affected. So it's important to organize this cross-cutting, cross-sector, multi-stakeholder dialogues. And I think last year a lot of time has been spent by the just transition negotiators on this whole of society approach. It is absolutely legitimate and relevant for agriculture as well. I think it's also important to support the community empowerment and action at the lowest level, and enable communities to implement the climate-friendly projects. It could be the use of renewables, it could be the agroecology, it could be the support of the local food systems. So that again gives the confidence, boosts the understanding, and also address the socioeconomic concerns. I think also it's important to ensure the vertical and horizontal policy coherence across the agriculture, environment, and climate change policy realms. And it's important to also view those sectoral policies in an integrated way, but also through the lens of human rights. And in the case of agriculture, the lens should be through the right to food. Maybe the last point is it's important to facilitate the innovation and research and development and investment in the low emission technologies, which are also the low cost technologies and high impact, because most of the agriculture actors are smallholder farmers who are not in the position to invest massively in the technological upgrading. And I really like the point that Mustafa Kamal made earlier, that the world is developing. We have to be abreast of the latest innovation and digitalization in the field. Yeah, that's it. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Inkar, so much. And indeed, there are examples, and some of them are also in large scale. I think documentation of that examples are important. Also important is that we continuously put in R&D investments into developing those innovations that are low emissions, but does not compromise food security. So it's not only the cost factor, but many of the low emission technologies right now aren't still have some kind of a yield penalty. So I think we have a long way in the agriculture sector to work on those just low emission technologies. So quickly, I want to come to you, Mustafa, with your second question. So what can we do about reskilling and supporting workers in the sector, which is the agri-food sector in this context? Do you have, again, successful examples, say, from other sectors like energy sector? Reskilling of labor would be important and has remained an important gap.
Yes, indeed. I think this is why also, even in the context of the work program, Just Transition, the second dialogue, the one that took place at Charm last year, focused on skills. But I want to, say in terms of agriculture now, I see the reskilling, upskilling effort from two fronts. The first is how you work with current farmers, and as colleagues have said, they must be small scale, farmers, to adapt to more ecological types of farming, to modernize so that you raise productivity even with small scale farming. And in that context, I see a very important opportunity. I said earlier about, young people. I see that across Africa, getting back to farm and looking for lands, because I do it myself. I'm getting into farming, and I know my brothers, everybody sees the value of farming today. And how you use technology to make that, a modern way of farming. But the second element, I think, which Elodie mentioned, is the important role of traditional knowledge, which we know is also in the hands of indigenous and tribal people. So, agriculture has been changing. We still have production for centuries because people have traditional ways of doing it. There is very useful old knowledge and traditions that have an important role to play as we modernize as well. So I think all of this can play an important role. And, I didn't speak a lot about the actors, but a lot of this has to be done with cooperatives. I think many countries are now helping work small farmers organize themselves in cooperatives, so that, you don't necessarily follow one linear path of industrial scale farming, but you work with small producers, help them organize in cooperatives, be more productive, have access to social security. And I see this as a way forward to achieve a just transition, delivering more and better jobs, rights at work, and the food security, important as the right to food, like Inga has put.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I think those are absolutely important points about the justice and the dignity and of labor and the ability to move to more innovative ways of doing things. So it's not that we have to stick to the traditional agricultural practices. So that's wonderful, Mustafa. And last I come to Elodie. We are at the hour, but Elodie, very, very briefly, if you can tell us, do you think of any particular way, research data or tools that we need to better inform the debate? I mean, we already talked of some of the gaps in terms of our information about what works, what doesn't, what's low cost, etc. So if there's anything additional you want to come in.
Yeah, just that basically the science is there, but the policies are not catching up. Agroecology contribution to climate mitigation, adaptation, and resilience are well evidenced in the literature. So I don't have time to go into example, but really to conclude that the just transition must not only be science informed but justice driven, where voices of impacted group and frontline communities are equally represented. So I will finish there.
Yes, I think that is a very powerful tone in which to finish. It's about science, but it's equally, even more importantly, it's about justice. It's about the voices of those most been impacted, been heard. So with that, we are at the end of it. Today we had again, I would say that we had a technical glitch. Our new software, which is called Splash, actually did not made it quite difficult for many of our participants to join. But the good news is that this is all being live cast on YouTube, and then we will be sharing the recording. So there would be more viewership later on. And we would also follow up with two more webinars in the coming weeks. One will focus on the work that we are doing with the Sharm el Sheikh Joint Work on Agriculture. Another one will focus on loss and damage with similar discussions. On the way forward to the just transition, I hope that the community of practice of all of us who work on just transition in agriculture grows by the day. And by the time we go to Belim in the end of this year, the voice around just transition in agriculture would be heard louder. And Brazil is the perfect place for that voice to be heard because of their own commitment to the transition agenda. So with that, thank you so much to all our panelists, all our speakers, and apologies to all the audience who wanted to join but couldn't because of the technical glitches. And we will see you again in a couple of weeks' time for our next webinar. Thank you and have a wonderful evening or